My sister Vanessa stood up at our mother's funeral and told 200 people that I had abandoned our mother in her final years. She said it with tears in her eyes. She said it with her voice breaking at exactly the right moments. She said it the way she had said everything our entire lives, with a performance so convincing that even I, for a moment, almost wondered if it were true. It was not true. I had been at our mother's bedside almost every single day for the last 3 years of her life. I have the records to prove it. 200 people at that funeral believed my sister. My own relatives looked at me with disappointment and quiet contempt. An aunt I had known my whole life turned away from me at the reception. And my sister Vanessa walked away with our mother's entire estate, a house, savings, everything, because 3 weeks before our mother died, Vanessa had convinced her, in her final confused days, that I no longer cared. This is the story of what I did about it. And I want to tell you now, before I begin, my sister made one mistake. She forgot that I am the kind of person who keeps everything. Chapter 1, The Beginning. My name is Claire. I am the younger of 2 daughters. Vanessa is 3 years older than me, and from the time we were children, she was the one people noticed when she walked into a room. I want to describe my sister honestly, because the easy version of this story is that Vanessa was always a villain. That is not quite true. The truer version is more unsettling. Vanessa was charming, magnetic, and from a very young age, extraordinarily skilled at controlling how other people saw her, and how they saw the people around her. Our mother's name was Eleanor. Eleanor was a warm, slightly anxious woman who had raised 2 daughters mostly alone after our father left when I was 7. She loved us both, but she had a particular weakness when it came to Vanessa. She believed Vanessa. Whatever Vanessa said, however unlikely, Eleanor accepted it. I learned early that I could not compete with my sister's version of events. If Vanessa said the broken vase was my fault, it was my fault. If Vanessa said she had not taken the money from Eleanor's purse, then somehow it had been me, or it had never happened at all. So I stopped competing. I became the quiet one. The reliable one. The one who did not make scenes. I told myself this was maturity. Looking back, I think it was something closer to surrender. I grew up, moved out, built a steady life. I became an accountant, which, like the librarian in another story you may have heard, turns out to matter enormously, because accountants keep records. We document. It is not a hobby, it is a reflex. Vanessa, meanwhile, moved through a series of dramatic jobs and dramatic relationships and dramatic financial situations, always landing on her feet, always with a story that explained why none of it was ever her fault. For years, our lives ran on parallel tracks that rarely crossed. And then our mother got sick. Chapter 2, The Betrayal. Eleanor was diagnosed with a slow-progressing illness when she was 71. In the early stages she was still herself, sharp, funny, independent. But the doctors were clear about where it was heading, and they were clear that over time she would need more and more care. I made a decision early. I lived 20 minutes from Eleanor. Vanessa lived in another state, 4 hours away. It made practical sense for me to be the primary caregiver, and beyond practicality, I wanted to. Eleanor was my mother. I loved her. For 3 years, I was there. I want to be specific about what there means, because this is the heart of the story. I visited Eleanor an average of 5 days a week. I took her to medical appointments, every single one. I managed her medications. I sat with her through bad afternoons and good ones. I brought her groceries, did her laundry, paid her bills when she could no longer manage them herself. And because I am who I am, because I am an accountant, because I document, I kept records of all of it. Not because I suspected anything. I want to be clear about that. I did not keep these records as a weapon. I kept them because keeping records is simply what I do. I logged Eleanor's appointments in a calendar. I saved every receipt. The medical practice kept its own attendance records, which would later matter more than I could have imagined. Vanessa visited perhaps 4 or 5 times a year. She would arrive with gifts and energy and grand gestures. She would take Eleanor out for an expensive lunch, post photographs of the two of them smiling, and leave again 2 days later. Eleanor would talk about Vanessa's visits for weeks. The 5 days a week I spent caring for her became invisible, ordinary, unremarkable. The 2 days Vanessa spent performing devotion became, in Eleanor's memory, evidence of which daughter truly loved her. I made my peace with this. Or I told myself I had. I want to tell you about one specific incident, because it explains everything about how Vanessa operated. About 2 years into Eleanor's illness, there was a family gathering, a cousin's wedding. Vanessa flew in for it. At the reception, an aunt asked Vanessa how Eleanor was doing, and Vanessa launched into a detailed, emotional account of Eleanor's care. The medications. The appointments. The difficult nights. Every single detail Vanessa described was something I had done. The medication schedule I managed. The appointments I drove her to. The difficult nights I sat through. But Vanessa described all of it in the first person, as though she had been the one doing it. And she did it so naturally, so seamlessly, that I sat there frozen, unable to find a way to correct the record without seeming petty and bitter at a wedding. The aunt looked at Vanessa with admiration and said, "You're such a good daughter." And Vanessa lowered her eyes modestly and said, "I just do what any daughter would do." I said nothing. I had learned, over a lifetime, that contradicting Vanessa in public only made me look like the jealous, difficult sister. So I sat in silence while my sister accepted praise for 3 years of my labor. That was Vanessa. She did not just take credit. She took it so smoothly that objecting made you look like the problem. I should have understood, that night at the wedding, what Vanessa was capable of. I should have understood that a person who could so effortlessly claim my caregiving as her own was a person who might, someday, do far worse. But I did not understand. I just felt the familiar old helplessness, the sense that my sister lived in a world where she could rewrite reality at will and everyone would believe her version. I drove home from that wedding and I said nothing to anyone. And Vanessa filed it away, another successful performance, another reminder that she could take whatever she wanted from me and face no consequences. In the last year of Eleanor's life, her mind began to slip. This is the cruelest part of certain illnesses, the way they take the person before they take the body. Eleanor became confused. She mixed up times and people. She would sometimes forget I had visited the day before. She became, in her vulnerability, more susceptible than ever to the strongest voice in the room. And in the final months, Vanessa came back. Not to help. I understood that quickly, though it took me longer to understand what she was actually doing. Vanessa moved into Eleanor's house for the last 3 months. She told me she wanted to be there at the end. She told me I had done so much and deserved a rest. She told me, and I, exhausted from 3 years of caregiving, foolishly grateful, that she would take over for a while. I stepped back. Just slightly. I still visited, but less. I let Vanessa take the lead, because she was insistent and because I was tired and because some part of me wanted to believe my sister had finally come through. That was the opening Vanessa needed. Chapter 3, The Decision. I did not find out what Vanessa had done until after Eleanor died. In those final 3 months, while I had stepped back, Vanessa had been busy. I would reconstruct it all later, but here is what happened. Vanessa spent those months telling Eleanor a story. A patient, repeated, daily story, that Claire had stopped coming. That Claire was too busy. That Claire did not care anymore. That it was Vanessa, only Vanessa, who was there for her now. To a confused, frightened, dying woman who had always believed Vanessa over everyone, this story took root. And in that state, 3 weeks before she died, Eleanor changed her will. The previous will, which Eleanor had made years earlier when her mind was clear, had split everything evenly between Vanessa and me. The new will left everything to Vanessa. I learned this in a lawyer's office 2 weeks after the funeral, the same funeral where Vanessa had stood up and told 200 people I had abandoned our mother. The lawyer, a careful man named David Reyes, read the terms aloud. The house, to Vanessa. The savings, to Vanessa. Everything, to Vanessa. I sat in that office and I felt the floor drop away. Not because of the money. I want you to understand that. I had a steady life, I did not need Eleanor's house. What broke me in that moment was the realization of what Vanessa had made our mother believe in her final days, that I, who had been there for 3 years, had abandoned her. My mother had died believing I did not love her. That was the wound. That was what Vanessa had done that was so much worse than stealing a house. I drove home from David Reyes's office. I sat in my kitchen. And I want to tell you honestly that for about a week, I did nothing but grieve, for my mother, and for the version of myself that 200 people now believed in. And then, on the 8th day, something shifted. I was sitting at my kitchen table, and my eyes fell on my calendar. My ordinary accountant's calendar, where for 3 years I had logged every visit, every appointment, every grocery run. 3 years of evidence. And I thought, Vanessa told a story. But stories can be checked against records. And I am a person who keeps records. Chapter 4, The Evidence. I called David Reyes the next morning. I told him I wanted to contest the will. He was honest with me. He said it was difficult, that contesting a will is an uphill battle, that I would need to prove either that Eleanor lacked the capacity to make the new will or that she had been subjected to undue influence. I said, what if I could prove both? He paused. Then he said, then you'd have a case. But Claire, you'd need real evidence. Not feelings. Not your word against your sister's. Documentation. I said, Mr. Reyes, I'm an accountant. Documentation is the one thing I have. Over the next several weeks, I built the most important file of my life. I started with my calendar. 3 years of logged visits, dates, times, what I had done each day. On its own, it was just my own record. But it was a starting framework, and everything else would hang on it. Then I went to the medical practice where I had taken Eleanor to every appointment. I requested the attendance records. And there it was, in the practice's own independent files, appointment after appointment, for 3 years, and on the contact and accompaniment notes, one name appeared again and again. Claire. Not Vanessa. Claire. The practice's records showed who had brought Eleanor to her appointments, who the staff had spoken to about her care, who had been the consistent point of contact. For 3 years, it was me. The records did not lie, and they could not be dismissed as a jealous sister's invention, because they belonged to a neutral third party. Then I found the pharmacy records, 3 years of prescriptions that I had picked up, logged under my contact information. Then the bank records showing the bills I had paid on Eleanor's behalf. Then something I had forgotten I had, text messages. Years of them. Messages between Eleanor and me, back when she was still clear, messages where she thanked me for coming, where we made plans, where her love for me was documented in her own words. And crucially, messages from the last year too, where her confusion was visible, where she sometimes forgot I had just visited. And then the piece that mattered most. I tracked down a woman named Maria, a part-time home health aide who had helped with Eleanor during the last year, before Vanessa moved in. Maria had no stake in any of this. She barely knew Vanessa. But she had been in that house, and she remembered clearly. When I contacted Maria and explained what had happened, she was quiet for a long moment. Then Maria said, I always wondered why I stopped being scheduled once the older sister arrived. And I always wondered why your mother started saying strange things about you near the end, when for the whole year before, all she did was talk about how good you were to her." Maria agreed to provide a statement. A neutral witness. Medical records. Pharmacy records. Bank records. 3 years of documented care. And a will changed 3 weeks before death, during a period when Eleanor's own medical records showed significant cognitive decline. I brought all of it to David Reyes. He went through it slowly, page by page. And when he finished, he looked up at me and said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Claire, your sister told a story. But you kept the truth. And the truth is going to win." Chapter 5, The Justice. The legal process took 11 months. I will not pretend it was painless. Vanessa fought. Vanessa, true to who she had always been, produced her own version of events, her own tears, her own performance. But this time, there was something Vanessa had never had to face before. Records. In every previous conflict of our lives, it had been Vanessa's word against mine, and Vanessa always won, because Vanessa was the better performer. But you cannot perform your way past a medical practice's attendance logs. You cannot cry your way past 3 years of pharmacy records. You cannot charm a neutral home health aide into forgetting what she saw. The medical evidence established that Eleanor had been in significant cognitive decline when the will was changed. The documentation established that I, not Vanessa, had been Eleanor's consistent caregiver for 3 years. Maria's statement established that Eleanor's sudden belief that I had abandoned her had appeared only after Vanessa moved in, and contradicted everything Eleanor had said for the entire preceding year. The court found that the final will was the product of undue influence exercised over a woman who lacked the capacity to resist it. The will was set aside. The previous will, the one Eleanor had made years earlier, with a clear mind, splitting everything evenly between her 2 daughters, was restored. But I want to tell you that the part that mattered most to me was never the money. It was a single sentence in the court's findings. A sentence that stated, in formal legal language, that the evidence showed Claire had been a devoted and consistent caregiver to her mother throughout her final years. A devoted and consistent caregiver. In the official record. Forever. The story Vanessa told 200 people at that funeral was now contradicted by a court of law. The aunt who had turned away from me at the reception called me, months later, and apologized. The relatives who had looked at me with contempt slowly, awkwardly, came back around. It did not undo what Vanessa had made my mother believe in her final days. Nothing could undo that. I have had to make my own private peace with the knowledge that for a few confused weeks, Eleanor doubted me, and with the deeper knowledge that for 3 years before that, she did not. I hold on to the 3 years. Vanessa and I do not speak now. I do not expect we ever will again. I have grieved that too, not the sister I lost, but the sister I never really had, the one I kept hoping she might become. I want to say one thing to anyone listening who has ever been the quiet one. The reliable one. The one whose contributions go unnoticed while someone louder takes the credit and rewrites the story. Keep your records. Not out of suspicion. Not out of bitterness. Simply because the truth deserves to be documented, and because there may come a day when someone tells a story about you that is false, and on that day, the quiet, patient, unglamorous habit of keeping track of what actually happened will be the thing that saves you. Vanessa was the better performer. But I was the better record keeper. And in the end, the records told the truth that the performance could not hide. Thank you for being here for this story. New story every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If you know someone who has been the quiet, overlooked one, send this to them. They may need to hear it. I will see you in the next one. There is more I need to tell you, because I have left out the hardest part. I want to tell you about the day I almost gave up. It was about 4 months into the legal process. Vanessa had just submitted her response to our filing, and it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Vanessa had written a detailed account claiming that I had been emotionally absent, that my visits had been brief and resentful, that I had been waiting for our mother to die so I could collect an inheritance. Every word of it was a lie. But it was a beautifully constructed lie, full of the specific, plausible-sounding details that Vanessa had always been so good at inventing. I read Vanessa's statement sitting in David Reyes's office, and when I finished, I put it down and I said, maybe I should just drop this. David Reyes looked at me carefully. He was a patient man, not given to dramatic speeches. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because she's better at this than I am. She always has been. She tells a story and people believe her. Even when I have the records, even when I have the proof, there's a part of me that's still that little girl who got blamed for the broken vase. Maybe she'll win anyway. She always wins." David Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that changed how I understood the entire situation. He said, "Claire, your sister wins arguments. That's a real skill, and she has it. But this isn't an argument. This is a question of fact. And facts don't care who's the better arguer." He pulled out the medical practice's attendance records, the neutral, third-party documentation showing my name, again and again, for 3 years. He said, "This piece of paper doesn't know your sister is charming. It doesn't know she cries at the right moments. It doesn't know she's been beating you in arguments since you were children. It just knows who brought your mother to her appointments. And the answer is you. 240 times over 3 years. You." He put the paper down. He said, "She's bringing a story to a fight about facts. You're bringing facts to a fight about facts. That's why you're going to win. Not because you're a better performer. Because you're right, and you can prove it." I went home that night and I thought about what David Reyes had said for a long time. And I understood that for my entire life, I had been fighting my sister on her terms, in the arena of stories, of performance, of who could be more convincing. And on those terms, I had always lost. But this time, the arena was different. This time, the question was not who tells a better story. The question was what actually happened. And what actually happened was documented, in neutral records, beyond the reach of Vanessa's considerable talents. For the first time in my life, I was not fighting my sister on her ground. I was fighting her on mine. I did not drop the case. I want to tell you about one more moment, near the end. It was during a deposition. Vanessa was being questioned by David Reyes, and he asked her, very simply, to explain the discrepancy between her claim that I had abandoned our mother and the medical practice's records showing that I had accompanied Eleanor to every appointment for 3 years. I watched my sister's face. For the first time in our entire lives, I watched Vanessa encounter a situation that her charm could not solve. She could not perform her way past a document. She could not cry her way past an attendance log. She could not redirect, deflect, or rewrite, because the record was sitting on the table in front of her, and it said what it said. Vanessa stumbled. She contradicted herself. She tried 3 different explanations and none of them held. And in that moment, I felt something I had waited my entire life to feel. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. I felt seen. For the first time, the truth of who had actually been there, who had actually loved our mother and shown up for her, day after day, year after year, was visible in a room where it could not be argued away. That was worth more than the house. It was worth more than the savings. It was worth more than all of it. After the ruling, I went to my mother's grave. I sat there for a long time. I told Eleanor what had happened. I told her about the records, about Maria, about the court's findings. I told her that I knew she had loved me, that I knew the 3 years had been real, even if the last 3 weeks had been poisoned by a story she was too vulnerable to resist. I forgave her for doubting me at the end. She had not really doubted me. She had been manipulated by the one person she had never been able to see clearly. And I forgave myself, finally, for stepping back in those last 3 months, for being tired, for being grateful, for trusting my sister just enough to give her the opening she needed. I had done nothing wrong. I had cared for my mother for 3 years. The records proved it. And the records, in the end, were simply the truth, written down by someone who had always known that the truth is worth keeping. I keep my records still. I always will. It is, I have come to understand, my way of insisting that what really happens matters, even when someone louder is determined to tell a different story. Thank you for listening to all of it.